Before gold transformed Spain into the richest empire on earth, the Iberian Peninsula was a region shaped by conflict, religion, and ambition. In the late 15th century, Spain was not yet a global power. It was a newly unified kingdom, emerging from centuries of internal struggle. The unification of Spain began with the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469. This alliance joined two powerful kingdoms and laid the foundation for a centralized Spanish state. Their reign focused on political unity, religious consolidation, and territorial expansion. Spain had just completed the Reconquista, ending Muslim rule with the fall of Granada in 1492. This victory strengthened royal authority and created a warrior culture eager for new conquests. However, Spain lacked the economic resources enjoyed by other European powers. Its economy was largely agrarian, with limited trade and modest state revenues. European competition for wealth was intensifying. Portugal dominated African trade routes, while Italian city-states controlled Mediterranean commerce. Spain needed a breakthrough, something that would elevate it beyond regional power status. That breakthrough came through exploration. In 1492, Spain sponsored Christopher Columbus, hoping to find a westward route to Asia. Instead, Columbus encountered the Americas. Though initially disappointed by the lack of spices, Spain soon realized it had discovered something far more valuable. The New World contained vast lands, powerful civilizations, and most importantly, unimaginable quantities of gold and silver. This moment marked the beginning of a transformation that would redefine global wealth, finance, and power. The early Spanish expeditions to the Americas were driven by three forces: gold, glory, and God. While religion and prestige played important roles, gold quickly became the dominant motivation. Early explorers encountered indigenous societies with advanced cultures and established economies. Gold held symbolic and religious value for these civilizations, but was not used as money in the European sense. To Spanish conquistadors, however, gold represented absolute wealth. Initial gold discoveries came from the Caribbean islands, particularly Hispaniola and Cuba. Spanish settlers extracted gold from rivers and shallow mines using forced indigenous labor. Although these early deposits were limited, they fueled Spain's appetite for expansion. The true turning point came with the conquest of powerful empires. In 1519, Hernán Cortés led a small force into Mexico and defeated the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs possessed vast quantities of gold, accumulated through tribute and craftsmanship. Spanish forces seized temples, melted artifacts, and shipped enormous treasure back to Spain. A decade later, Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire in South America. The Incas controlled rich gold and silver resources across the Andes. Spanish ransom demands for the captured Inca emperor produced rooms filled with gold and silver, one of the largest treasure hauls in history. These conquests transformed Spain overnight. Gold and silver flooded into royal treasuries. Ships carrying precious metals crossed the Atlantic regularly, guarded by armed fleets. Spain became the wealthiest nation in Europe, commanding financial influence unmatched by any rival. However, this sudden wealth came with consequences. Spain became increasingly dependent on New World treasure. Instead of building productive industries, it relied on extracted wealth to fund wars, palaces, and imperial ambitions. The foundations of the Spanish Empire were built not on sustainable economic growth, but on gold. While gold captured the imagination of Europe, it was silver that truly powered the Spanish Empire. The discovery of the massive silver deposits at Potosí in present-day Bolivia transformed Spain's global position and reshaped the world economy. In 1545, Spanish prospectors discovered silver in Cerro Rico, the rich mountain of Potosí. The scale of the deposit was unprecedented. The mountain contained vast veins of high-quality silver, enough to supply global markets for centuries. Potosí quickly became one of the largest and richest cities in the world, with a population exceeding that of London or Paris at its peak. To exploit this wealth, Spain established an extensive mining system. Indigenous labor was forced into service through the Meta system, a labor draft inherited from Inca administration but intensified by Spanish rule. Workers labored under brutal conditions, extracting silver from deep shafts with primitive tools. Mortality rates were extremely high. Technological innovation increased production. The introduction of the mercury amalgamation process allowed silver to be extracted from lower-grade ores. Mercury from Spanish-controlled mines was transported across continents, linking distant regions into a single economic network. The silver of Potosí was minted into coins known as pieces of 8, which became the first global currency. These coins circulated across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, facilitating international trade. Spain used silver to fund imperial administration, pay armies and navies, settle debts with European bankers, purchase goods from Asia. Silver connected Spain to China, where demand for silver was immense. Through Manila, Spanish silver flowed into Asian markets in exchange for silk, porcelain, and spices. This marked the beginning of true global trade. However, the massive inflow of silver also had destabilizing effects. Prices rose across Europe in what became known as the price revolution. Wealth increased in nominal terms, but purchasing power declined. Spain's economy became distorted, dependent on imported goods rather than domestic production. Potosí symbolized both the height of Spanish wealth and the seeds of future decline. Transporting gold and silver from the Americas to Spain required one of the most sophisticated logistical systems of the early modern world. To protect its wealth, Spain created the treasure fleet system, a highly organized maritime operation. Spanish treasure ships sailed in heavily guarded convoys known as flotas. These fleets followed fixed routes and schedules, gathering precious metals from ports across the Americas before crossing the Atlantic together. Warships accompanied merchant vessels to defend against pirates and rival powers. The fleets carried gold and silver bullion, minted coins, agricultural products, colonial taxes, and tribute. Seville became the primary entry point for New World wealth. The Spanish crown tightly regulated trade through the Casa de Contratación, ensuring that royal taxes were collected and commerce remained under state control. Despite these precautions, treasure fleets were vulnerable. Storms, shipwrecks, piracy, and warfare threatened shipments. English, Dutch, and French privateers targeted Spanish vessels, seeking to weaken Spain and seize its wealth. The wealth flowing through the fleets financed Spain's imperial ambitions. Spanish kings used treasure to wage wars across Europe, support allies, and enforce Catholic dominance. Gold and silver became instruments of power rather than tools of economic development. As reliance on treasure increased, Spain neglected industrial growth. Manufactured goods were imported using silver, draining wealth abroad. This imbalance weakened Spain's long-term economic position. The treasure fleets symbolized Spain's global dominance, but they also exposed the empire's vulnerability. Control over wealth depended on fragile sea routes and constant military protection. The massive influx of gold and silver from the Americas did not simply enrich Spain. It transformed the entire European economy. Between the 16th and early 17th centuries, Europe experienced sustained inflation known as the price revolution. Prices of goods, food, and land rose dramatically over several generations, reshaping economic relationships across the continent. Before the arrival of New World metals, Europe had limited money supply. Economic growth was constrained by scarce precious metals. The sudden increase in silver and gold expanded money supply rapidly, reducing the value of currency. As more coins entered circulation, each unit of money purchased less than before. Spain was the epicenter of this inflation. Despite receiving vast quantities of treasure, Spanish citizens often felt poorer in real terms. Wages failed to keep pace with rising prices, while fixed income groups suffered the most. Nobles and landowners benefited temporarily as rents increased, but long-term economic imbalance persisted. The price revolution had several effects: rising cost of living, increased inequality, decline of feudal structures, expansion of capitalist markets. Other European nations adapted more effectively. Countries like the Netherlands and England used inflation to stimulate trade and industry. Spain, however, relied heavily on imports, paying for goods with silver rather than producing them domestically. The inflationary impact revealed a key weakness of wealth based on extraction rather than productivity. Gold and silver created the illusion of wealth but undermined economic stability. Spain's gold financed one of the most ambitious imperial projects in history. Spanish monarchs viewed treasure as a means to assert dominance across Europe and defend Catholicism. The result was nearly continuous warfare. Spain fought wars in the Netherlands, Italy, France, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic. Gold and silver funded massive armies, navies, and fortifications. Spanish kings borrowed heavily from European bankers, using future treasure shipments as collateral. This system created immediate power but long-term vulnerability. Military spending outpaced revenue. Even with New World treasure, expenses exceeded income. Spain declared multiple state bankruptcies in the 16th and 17th centuries, damaging its creditworthiness. The reliance on debt shifted wealth to foreign financiers. Much of Spain's gold flowed to bankers in Genoa, Germany, and the Low Countries. Treasure financed wars, but profits accrued elsewhere. Imperial overreach weakened Spain's economic foundations. As rivals industrialized and expanded trade, Spain remained dependent on declining silver production and military force. This period marked the beginning of imperial decline, driven by financial exhaustion rather than military defeat alone. As Spanish treasure flowed into Europe, it created an illusion of limitless wealth. In reality, much of the gold and silver never stayed in Spain. The empire depended heavily on international banking networks to manage its finances, and this dependence slowly eroded its economic sovereignty. Spanish monarchs regularly borrowed from powerful banking families, especially those in Genoa, Augsburg, and Antwerp. These bankers advanced large sums to the crown in exchange for future treasure shipments and high interest rates. Gold and silver became guarantees for loans rather than tools of development. This system produced several long-term problems. First, interest payments consumed a large share of imperial revenue. Second, financial decisions were increasingly influenced by foreign creditors. Third, Spain's economy became disconnected from real production, relying on incoming bullion to service old debts. Repeated military conflicts intensified the crisis. When treasure shipments were delayed by storms, piracy, or declining mine output, Spain defaulted on its debts. The crown declared multiple royal bankruptcies, shaking European financial markets. These defaults damaged trust. Lenders demanded higher interest or refused loans altogether. Spain's ability to project power weakened as financial credibility collapsed. Gold, once a symbol of strength, became a source of fragility. The Spanish case demonstrated a critical lesson. Wealth without financial discipline leads to decline. By the mid-17th century, the era of effortless treasure was ending. The richest veins of gold and silver had been exhausted. Mining costs rose and production declined. Indigenous labor populations were devastated, reducing workforce availability. At the same time, Spain faced competition. Other European powers expanded colonial holdings, developed trade networks, and built manufacturing industries. The Dutch and English empires grew stronger while Spain stagnated. Without growing treasure inflows, Spain struggled to maintain its empire. Inflation persisted, debt accumulated, and military power diminished. The economic model built on extraction proved unsustainable. Spain remained a significant power, but its dominance faded. The empire that gold had built could not survive without economic reform. The impact of Spanish gold and silver extended far beyond Spain itself. For the first time in history, the world's major regions became financially interconnected. Spanish treasure acted as the bloodstream of early globalization. Silver from the Americas flowed into Europe and then onward to Asia. China, operating under a silver-based tax system, absorbed vast quantities of Spanish silver. This created a global trade loop linking the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Goods, labor, and capital moved across oceans on an unprecedented scale. Spanish coins became trusted international money. The Spanish silver dollar circulated from the markets of London to the ports of Manila. It influenced the development of modern currencies, including the US dollar. However, this global integration also spread instability. Inflation reached multiple continents. Economies dependent on silver suffered when supply fluctuated. Entire regions became vulnerable to disruptions in mining or shipping. Spanish gold demonstrated that control over money could shape global power, but only temporarily. Other nations learned from Spain's mistakes, emphasizing productivity, trade, and financial institutions over raw extraction. The era of Spanish dominance marked the transition from medieval economies to the modern global financial system. The story of the Spanish Empire offers timeless lessons about wealth, power, and economics. Gold built the empire, but it also exposed its weaknesses. First, resource wealth alone does not guarantee long-term prosperity. Spain's reliance on gold discouraged innovation, industry, and entrepreneurship. Second, debt can magnify both power and decline. Borrowing against future wealth created immediate strength, but long-term vulnerability. Third, inflation erodes real wealth. Spain's treasure increased money supply without increasing productivity, reducing purchasing power. Finally, sustainable power depends on institutions, not extraction. Nations that invested in trade, manufacturing, and finance eventually surpassed Spain. Today's economies face similar challenges: currency dominance, debt expansion, inflation, and resource dependence. The Spanish experience reminds us that true wealth lies not in accumulation, but in balanced economic systems. The empire built on gold ultimately declined, but its legacy shaped the modern financial world.